They drive around the end of them. I've had that happen on 3 occasions. People are still willing to take that risk.
What weighs on Wayne Elliott's mind still is that he could just as easily have been driving a passenger train that morning at Lismore, and what might have been.
If it had been a passenger train, it would have been an absolute disaster. It would have been catastrophic. Fortunately, it wasn't a passenger train, but if it had been, it would have been terrible.
Then came Kerrang. Just 10 weeks ago, the Victorian country town became notorious as the scene of one of Australia's worst ever rail accidents. 11 passengers on this train died, and 14 more were injured when a heavy truck hit the side of their carriage, ripping it open. Investigations into why this crash happened are still continuing. The truck driver is to face trial for culpable driving. In the wake of Kerrang, the Victorian government has announced a massive upgrading of key level crossings with advanced warning signs and rumble strips. But Kerrang's level crossing already had warning lights and bells, visible from a kilometre across the flat farmland.
It's interesting, the amount of incidents where people go, where the most deaths occur, is more than where there are all those boom gates flashing lights. So that's not really, and they occur in daylight, in fair weather conditions.
With truckies spending well over $500,000 on a new rig these days, most carrying on-board UHF radios, there's a view that rail and road operators should work with government to find a much safer technological solution than just warning signs and lights.
We see that in the M5 in Sydney, when you go into the tunnel, the car radio is being overtaken by announcements that are made on through the PA system. What a great idea.
So why don't we have those kind of transponders communicating between trucks and trains?
Well, I can't give you the answer to that. I really just don't know.
What we are still using is our historical legacy of protection against motor cars, when today the major problem is the truck.
Level crossing safety expert Dr. Eric Wigglesworth argues that governments are failing to heed the impact of allowing much heavier and longer trucks on our roads alongside rail.
A piece of research I did some 30 years ago, 3 trucks out of 85 were involved in consecutive level crossings in Victoria. 3 out of 85 is a fairly low figure. The most recent figures I have are for the last 7 years, in which case there were 21 fatal crossings, of which 6 involved trucks. So we now have 6 out of 21 instead of 3 out of 85.
To explain why he thinks this is happening, he did a simple test at this typical level crossing. This one's protected with boom gates, but most of the thousands of crossings across the country have nothing more than a give way or stop sign. Unlike this one, those passive crossings rely on drivers having an adequate sighting distance to make it across after checking for an approaching train. Bear in mind that a semi-trailer, by law, is meant to have 17.6 seconds to get across. A B-double, 18.6 seconds. Without the barrier here to warn of an approaching train, a truck would barely have enough time to safely cross.
There's not much in it, is there?
It's very little. There's not very much in the way of a safety margin at all.
One of the things that you said while we were doing the filming then, as the train was approaching, was that it looked slow. It wasn't, was it?
No, it wasn't. It just looked slow. And that's one of the reasons why I think so many people fall into the trap. They assume that because the train looks to be moving very slowly, it is moving slowly, whereas in fact, it's not doing it at the same speed as a motor car or a vehicle. It's travelling at 120k or whatever it might be. It is, in fact, moving very fast. And in the last few seconds, when it rocketed past us, we realised how fast it was getting.
And if, heaven forbid, a heavy truck does get caught on a crossing, its huge mass is another nightmare for train drivers.
Over the last few years, we've seen the trucking industry and trucks get bigger and heavier, longer. So as a result, what we've seen is that a few years ago, if you had a level crossing accident, there was normally very little risk of the locomotive or the train derailing. But what we're seeing now is the trucks are so long, so heavy, so huge in terms of dimensions, that a train hitting a truck now has an equal probability that it will derail.
There's a much broader debate behind the recent spate of level crossing smashes than merely raising public awareness of the dangers in taking on a train. The amount of freight that needs to be moved nationally is expected to double in the next 20 years. And to cope with that, governments are approving increasingly bigger trucks on our roads and backing much greater use of rail freight on our tracks. But has enough thought been given to whether our existing road and rail infrastructure can bear it? The concern is that these level crossing smashes where road and rail meet are just going to get worse unless governments massively upgrade our creaking rail infrastructure.
Is there the political will?
I think there isn't a political will because there aren't, I may sound very brutal, we don't kill enough people at railway level crossings.
Is the level crossing safety concerns that are starting to mount a consequence of the increased truck traffic on our roads?
Oh, both increased truck traffic and increased rail traffic. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
You accept that?
Absolutely.
We're riding a massive freight train this trip with driver Roger Farrer from Adelaide to Port Augusta. He knows the track here like the back of his hand, and he mentions a black spot level crossing at Two Wells.
There's quite a few places where feed trucks from piggeries and dairies and that cross the track and they're double and your road's that close. So
You're kidding?
And so by the time they stop, the trailer's still on the track.
And do they get hit?
No, I've not hit one yet, but there's, you know, as you say, it's been a bit close sometimes.
Just over a week after we pass through, the Ghan passenger train collides with a truck here at Two Wells. The truck driver and 3 train passengers are injured, but mercifully no one is killed. Sobering though to see the front of the Ghan locomotive back in the yard, the force of the impact obvious. And as train driver Roger Farrer demonstrates, even if he sees a vehicle on a crossing ahead, there's little he can do about it. A lot of folk, it seems, don't quite understand the physics involved in stopping a train like this when it sees a car ahead on a level crossing. Roger here's driving a train that's got 4,800 tonnes of cargo on board. It's nearly 2 kilometres long, and if he hits that emergency brake, it's going to take him about 1.5 kilometres before he stops. In fact, it takes a lot longer than that.
Well, we're just coming up to 2 kilometres and we're still doing 60 k's an hour.
We finally stop at well over 2 kilometres from where we pulled the brake.
That's very sobering.
This is Salisbury, a level crossing on Adelaide's outskirts where 5 years ago poor planning and road driver carelessness caused a tragedy. Just after school ended, a passenger train collided with a car and bus at this level crossing. 4 people died and 26 were injured. No blame was pointed at the train driver. But half a decade on, that driver, Graham Parslow, is still traumatised by the awful events of that day.
It was an event that was going to happen. It didn't matter what my mate and I did. It was just blow the horn, put on the emergency brakes, put the brakes into emergency and just sit back and wait for the accident to happen. And it'd be a pretty terrible death, I think, getting hit by us, I think. Being dragged for 1 or 2 k's waiting for us to stop.
Graham's an exemplary train driver, but in his time driving, he's been involved in 8 major level crossing accidents, 3 major ones with trucks and buses.
They always say that, you know, it's not your fault, you know, there's nothing you can do, but the problem is that it happened.
What distresses drivers like Graham is that tragic accidents like Salisbury and Kerrang were entirely avoidable. And no matter how safe a driver he is, it's only a matter of time before the next one.
That story reported by Ross Coulthard.